Hey everybody, this video is called The Miraculous Victory, and today we're going to continue our pass through here in the book of Joshua, looking at the 10th chapter, where we're going to look at the southern kings being conquered. So Joshua chapter 10 verse 1 through 5, it says, "Now it came to pass when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he did to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, that they feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. Therefore Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoham, king of Hebron, Param, king of Jarmuth, Japhiah, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, that we may attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel. Therefore the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they and their armies, and camped before Gibeon, and made war against it." So Gibeon and 3 other towns were attacked by a coalition of these 5 cities. And Israel came to the rescue, with God given the victory to come, as you're going to see in verse 10, as it says, "So the Lord routed them before Israel, killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, chased them along the road that goes to Beth Horon, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah." And please forgive me with some of these names. They're not very easy names in the Old Testament all the time. And many times I feel that a lot of preachers will not hit on the Old Testament because of how difficult the names can be. But the first thing I thought was interesting in verse 1 is we see the king of Jerusalem, Adoni-Zedek. And that means the Lord of righteousness. And now he sets himself against Joshua. So to me, he does not seem to be a representative of the Lord of righteousness. He seems more to be the Antichrist in representation. He's a false Lord of righteousness. And while they feared, they would still launch attacks. Fear doesn't mean anything to the enemy. The enemy will go on to attack, but not against Israel directly, but they were going to attack the Gibeonites, which Israel made a pact, or not a pact, but a vow to the Gibeonites in a peace treaty. And so verse 6 here says, "And the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal, saying, Do not forsake your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the mountains have gathered together against us." So in verse 6 here, we see that the Gibeonites, they call for help to Israel, as they saw Israel as their helpers and their protectors. In verse 7, "So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, and he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor." So Joshua and the leaders, they were faithful to their vows in the last chapter. And they remained faithful to fulfill the spirit of the vow he made to the Gibeonites. In verse 8, "And the Lord said to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you." So Joshua is once again, as a common theme in this book, is given the command to fear not. And after all, most would be in fear when you have a confederation of 5 kings rising up. But Joshua could not fear, not because of the promise of victory behind it. In verse 9, "Joshua therefore came upon them, and suddenly have marched all night from Gilgal." So Joshua here, he's responding in faith by participating in the work and the will of God. And the march was hard work, as Gilgal to Gibeon involved over a 3,000-foot incline. So it's kind of like going up a small mountain. And it was a distance of about 20 miles or so. And that would bring about 8 to 10 hours of marching, and for many of us, probably a lot longer through the night. In verse 10 through 15, it says, "So the Lord routed them before Israel, killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, chased them along the road that goes to Beth Horon, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And it happened as they fled before Israel and were on the descent of Beth Horon, that the Lord cast down large hailstones from heaven on them, as far as Azekah, and they died. And there were more who died from the hailstones than the children of Israel killed with the sword. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, but did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there has been no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord heeded to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all of Israel with him, to the camp of Gilgal. So verses 10 through 15, we see that the enemies of God are routed into a panic, and these large hailstones were miraculously given by God. These hailstones were rather large, and some will say that an eclipse hid the sun and kept the heat from Joshua's worn soldiers and allowing coolness for battle. But some people, they see it as a poetic description and not a literal fact. In Jasher, it means upright, and the book of Jasher is thought to be of the same book from Numbers 21 verse 14 that is known as the book of the wars of the Lord. And the book of Jasher is mentioned again later in 2 Samuel 1:18. And the book was a compilation of Hebrew songs that were in honor of Israel's leaders and exploits in battle. And some say that the sun standing still cannot be scientific, but when we see that the sun stands still in 2022, whatever year we're in, 2022, we see, when you watch the news, if you ever watch the weather report, sometimes they tell you about the sun rising and the sun setting, but we know that the sun does not literally set and rise. The sun does not, disappear away from us. So meteorologists use sunrise and sunset without thinking how the sun doesn't really set and rise. So it's more a figurative like speech. And then so verses 16 through 27, a large length here, it says, "But these 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in a cave at Makkedah, and it was told Joshua, saying, The 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave at Makkedah. So Joshua said, Roll large stones against the mouth of the cave, and set men by it to guard them. And do not stay there yourselves, but pursue your enemies and attack their rear guard. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hand." Then it happened, while Joshua and the children of Israel made an end of slaying them with a very large slaughter till they had finished, that those who escaped entered fortified cities. And all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace. No one moved his tongue against any of the children of Israel. Then Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave, and bring out those 5 kings to me from the cave." And they did so. They brought out those 5 kings to him from the cave, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and the king of Eglon. So it was when they brought out those kings to Joshua, that Joshua called for all the men of Israel, and said to the captains of the men of war who went with him, "Come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings." And they drew near, and they put their feet on their necks. Then Joshua said to them, "Do not be afraid nor dismayed. Be strong and of good courage, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight." Afterward, Joshua struck them and killed them and hanged them on 5 trees, and they were hanging on the trees until evening. So it was at the time of the going down of the sun that Joshua commanded, and they took them down from the trees, cast them into the cave where they have been hidden, and laid large stones against the cave's mouth, which remain until this very day. So there's some things I want to point out through these verses here. And the kings were imprisoned, and they were to be dealt with later. And we see that they were executed, as there could not be a accommodation with the 3 Canaanite kings. And feet on the necks in verse 24, it symbolizes victory and promised assurance of future conquests. In verses 28 through 39, another large length of verses. At first, I wanted to point out here in verse 27, we see it says, "So it was at that time of the going down of the sun that Joshua commanded that they took them down from the trees and cast them into the cave where they have been hidden, and laid a large stones against the cave's mouth, which remain until this very day." And, with the stones being rolled in front of the cave's mouth, it's a picture of when Jesus was buried, when they rolled the stone to try to keep the disciples or Jesus' followers from taking his body. But just a side mention there. Verse 28 through 39 says, "On that day Joshua took Makkedah and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed them, all the people who were in it. He let none remain. He also did to the king of Makkedah as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua passed from Makkedah, and all Israel with him, to Libnah, and they fought against Libnah. And the Lord delivered it and its king to the hand of Israel. He struck it and all the people who were in it with the edge of the sword. He let none remain in it, but did to its king as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua passed from Libnah, and all Israel with him, to Lachish, and they encamped against it and fought against it. And the Lord delivered Lachish into the hand of Israel, who took it on the 2nd day, and struck it and all the people who were in it with the edge of the sword, according to all that he had done in Libnah. Then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish, and Joshua struck him and his people until they left him none remaining. From Lachish, Joshua passed to Eglon, and all Israel with him, and they encamped against it and fought against it. They took it on the day and struck it with the edge of the sword. All the people who were in it he utterly destroyed that day, according to all that he had done to Lachish. So Joshua went up from Eglon, and all Israel with him, to Hebron, and they fought against it, and they took it and struck it with the edge of the sword, its kings, all its cities, and all the people who were in it. He left none remaining, according to all that he had done to Eglon, but utterly destroyed it, and all the people who were in it. Then Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to Debir, and they fought against it. And he took it and its kings and all its cities. They struck them with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed all the people who were in it. He left none remaining, as he had done to Hebron. So he did to Debir and its king, as he had done to Libnah and its king. So, big list of the cities here that are listed as fallen. In verse 40 through 43, to wrap up the chapter, says, So Joshua conquered all the land, the mountain country in the south, and the lowland, and the wilderness slopes, and all their kings. He left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breath, as the Lord God of Israel had commanded. And Joshua conquered them from the Kadesh Barnea as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon. And all these kings in their land Joshua took at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all of Israel with him, to the camp of Gilgal. So, very long chapter, as mentioned here, but this is the ending here is summarizing Joshua's southern campaign. And the tribute belongs to the Lord for all victories. All thanksgiving belongs to the Lord for all the victories. But to wrap up here, quick wrap up, we see the southern kings of Canaan, they assemble for an attack against Gibeon. And we see the key player named Adoni-Zedek, meaning the Lord of righteousness. But we see that he is totally opposite of the Lord of righteousness. He's more of the picture for the Antichrist. And we saw the plea for help from Gibeon. We saw that Joshua and the people of Israel, they remained faithful to their vow to the Gibeonites, that they would protect them, that they would honor the peace treaty. And we saw God once again command Joshua to fear not, as he made a promise to Joshua. And what ought Joshua not to fear? You know, why does Joshua need to keep hearing fear not throughout this book? It's because fear is a sign. Fear is truly unbelief. And it's an unwillingness to believe what God has promised. It's to not believe that God is the fulfiller of what he says. And we saw that Joshua responded in faith as he went on to march all night in Gilgal. And we witnessed that God miraculously fought on behalf of Israel. And we see the miraculous use of very large hailstones. And where else in the Bible do we find God using hailstones on people? And you have to go to Revelation chapter 16. In verse 21, it says here, "And a great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. Men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since that plague was exceedingly great." So for those who believe in a future event of Revelation, we see it speaks of hailstones. So those who believe in a future judgment of the tribulation, there's going to be large hailstones that take place. And we saw the completion of the battle. We saw the execution of these wicked Canaanite kings. And the king Adoni-Zedek, it led the nations to attack Joshua. But they ended up being cowards, and they hid in the caves. And does that sound familiar? Let's go to Revelation chapter 6 next, verse 15 and 16. It says here, "And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb." So during the sixth seal spoken about in chapter 6, the people and the rulers, they run to the caves wishing for the judgment to end. And like I said, you can see it as figurative or in a literal sense. I'm not getting into a whole eschatology message. I just wanted to show you a very similar text that's spoken about in the New Testament here. And so we saw the fall of the Canaanite cities, and there were 6 cities total without a single loss for Israel that were defeated. And one thing that we should pick out of Joshua is that there is victory through God and only through God. And I want to look at Colossians chapter 2, verse 15. It says here, Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphant over them in it. So we see that there is still victory in Jesus Christ for us in the new covenant, as Jesus won victory at the cross. And now we live in light of that victory. And I want to look at Romans chapter 8, very popular passage. Romans chapter 8, verse 37. It says, "And yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." And we are more than conquerors through Christ who loved us. And, you know, we have victory as Christians as well. And that's going to wrap up this video. We'll see you tomorrow as we're going to look at the defeat of the northern armies. So I hope you have a great rest of your night. We'll see you back tomorrow for chapter 11. God bless.